And now we turn our attention to the future of historic racing. I absolutely love historic racing. I got to go up the Goodwood Hill in the Beast of Turin, the Fiat S76. It's a beast, absolutely stunning thing. So historic racing is something close to my heart. We're going to find out really how it's going to stay with us in the future. Without any ado, as I hand over to Adrian Goodsell, the director of Kimberley Media Group. Adrian, this is all on you now, the publisher of Historic Racing Technology. How are we going to continue racing with historics in the future? You're going to find out in the next 40 minutes or so.
Thank you very much, Bryn.
Over to you.
So good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining, all of you, wherever you may be. I don't know, because normally I'm in the same room as you, but it's very nice to connect with you. And firstly, I'd just like to start by saying thank you to the Autosport team and Bryn and everyone who's brought this together, because I know the pandemic has thrown up some obstacles for most of us, and it is really nice to connect in some form, shape or form. So thank you for that. And also from the panels that I've watched throughout the day, they've been very interesting, and there's been some recurring themes. So I'm pleased that we can kind of bring them into this session. As far as we're concerned for this topic, we've got the future of historic racing, the kind of back to the future feeling, and a lot of people think they know what historic racing is. I thought I did. I had probably the wrong perception of it many years ago. I was very much with race tech, and I still am with race tech, and race tech looks very much at the future of technology. But after about 30 years of race tech being published, around 6 or 7 years ago, Kimberley Media were asked to look at the historic racing market, and a number of our suppliers said, look, this is a growing sector, and there's quite a lot happening here. So and actually I'm pleased to say that our publisher Sahela Kimberley worked with the team sort of coming up with the idea for historic racing as a title. So we kind of for around 7 years have been working in that space, but I know recently Hero Events did put out some figures. For those of you that are not aware, the historic racing scene and sector just within the UK contributes the racing side £371 million. You've got owner clubs which are contributing £111 million. You've got historic racing magazines such as our own Historic Racing Technology and a few others which contribute 59 million. That's not all coming our way. And in total, there is £502 million gross to our economy. So it's a huge sector, and a lot of you will have heard, as Bryn mentioned, people kind of think of Goodwood, which is certainly very much established in the historic racing calendar, and you've got Festival of Speed, but obviously revivals and stuff like that. There's things taking place all around the country, growing areas like Bicester Heritage, and you've also got things like Silverstone Classic. So we wanted to discuss today, really, and I'm really grateful for the people on this panel, because we're going to move through a few different sessions, and I hope some of the younger audience are with us as well, because there are opportunities within motorsport that basically aren't just about Formula One or about Formula E, although there's some fantastic opportunities there. I know that Hugh Chambers mentioned earlier that if you look at how many racers and how many people are involved, obviously there's thousands of engineers in something like Formula One, but the number of drivers is very, very small, really. But if you look at the opportunities to get involved in motorsport driving perspective, there's thousands of opportunities out there and very affordable. So I'd like to start with the panelist, Mark Busfield from Bolton University. But Mark basically looks after the National Centre for Motorsport Engineering. So Mark, if I may, can I kick off with you, and can you just sort of give an introduction, because you've got a wealth of history in motorsport, and then if you could just let the audience know what Bolton are up to.
Absolutely. Thanks, Adrian, and thanks for the time. So personally, my background has involved for professional motorsport for over 35 years, working for manufacturer teams. And I landed on the shores of Bolton 4 years ago with a brand new facility to create the motorsport faculty here. That has borne about significant challenges and also brought some great adventure along the way. So a motorsport engineering degree course is really hard to sandwich and put into it everything you need to do in a 3-year course. And it necessarily could sometimes require an MSc to top it up. But you will try and understand all the areas. But we have also this fractional difference between modern technology. So there's new risks and new challenges constantly advancing against us. So battery power, hydrogen, etc. And new technology. And it's important that we embrace the new technology, whether it be additive, new composite materials and such like. So we came into historic motorsport as a university, not by accident, but kind of by default. So we'd created a series of student projects in our first year, and we embarked on doing the British Rallycross Championship, which we managed to successfully win in our first year. And then we were approached by Bob Fernley, previously the team principal of Force India, who many years ago fortunately looked after Ensign UK and still owns a good number of the Ensign racing cars. Ensign at that time had a driver, Jim Crawford, and Jim Crawford was from Bolton. So there's a tenuous link. Bob was from the Northwest. Jim Crawford was from Bolton. So there was a plan, in essence, to put together a process whereby we could run or display some of these Ensign vehicles in our new purpose-built facility. And that's how it started out. Things grew significantly from that point, and we ended up having three, or we still have got three cars. So we've got a 1981 180B, we've got a 179 from 79, and we've also got a later Indy car. And students who we had looking at modern motorsport, who clearly defined upon themselves that they wanted to be working in Formula One or Formula E, touring cars, World Rally or whatever, were taken to the passion of this Formula One historic project significantly, and we were actually swept away by the enthusiasm for it. So we created, in essence, two student cohorts. Firstly, one group who looked after the preparation, maintenance and servicing of the vehicle, which is no mean task in itself, looking at a 40-year-old car. It has to have a technical passport, it has to be crack tested, everything has to be lifed. So it needs a thorough going over, bearing in mind that the chassis is an amalgam of some aluminium and some composite parts. So one group was doing that, while another cohort then started to do a reverse engineering process, whereby we used modern technology. So we were able to scan the car. Once we'd scanned the car, they could digitize it, put it back into a drawing, and then we then started off in several other programs looking at CFD, FEA, and such like. So in essence, we've got more engineering input now to a car designed 40 years ago than there was 40 years ago, which has given the students an absolutely wonderful opportunity. And it even gives us the chance now to then look at what is something from a time warp 40 years ago and understand fully what happened back in the day. You know, the 180B is a ground effect car. And timely as it was last year, we ran the car for the first time, and then Johnny Herbert drove it, and we had a feature done with Sky TV, which was a wonderful opportunity again for the students to do that in the COVID. But because the regulations have pushed back, ground effects now come into Formula One next year. So here we are, sort of 40 years back in time, redeveloping and understanding how it came about the first time and how we can take it forward. So that's, you know, a wonderful opportunity for the students to do that. And certainly all the ones that we've had on the project have really embraced the historic scene, being part of it, going to the races and such like. So it's been a real eye-opener.
So would you say then that if you look at historic racing and the technology that that the students can learn on the courses, that actually that is transferable into modern day motorsport as well? Because I know when we've spoken to some Formula One teams and interviewed them, they said actually some of the skills that are missing and lacking is the understanding of the engineering and actual practicality of it, and how one thing affects another. I mean, is that, do they run in tandem from the course?
Yeah, I mean, they do. So we haven't changed anything. So our course content is balanced for whereby in your first year you'll phone simple basic practice of how theory works out, practical application. We then embed that in the second and third year, where the students will get hands-on and obviously working on their own various projects. Culminating in third year, they will also do something like Formula Student. So they will design and build a car from scratch. So the elements that actually help us to do with modern technology and modern ways of thinking that can add value. A case in point was we did a test at Anglesey with the F1 car last year, and we were suffering from brake temperature problems. Now, we'd only got, I think at that time, 3 weeks before the next race, which was at Brands Hatch. The students took themselves a reverse engineering project whereby they looked at how we could actually get the air temperature down and looked at the ducting and such like. And we used a modern method. We actually printed some brake ducts, which they did overnight. And if you go back, 40 years, and if that project had been done 40 years ago, that would have probably taken a designer. You'd have to have a pattern maker. The pattern maker had to make a mold, and the mold make a part. And that could have taken at the best probably 2 weeks. And the students came up with an idea. We approved it, printed the first version, tried it, seemed okay, then printed the actual versions. So what would have taken 2 weeks, we did in 2 days, and it was all done by students. So they actually feel part and parcel. They were adding value. It was their project. It wasn't dictated by lecturers or members of staff, and they could see the effect. You can put a temp gun on it, and you can see how the brake temperature has dropped. So it was interesting to do those sorts of things.
And I guess you, along with a lot of problem solving, one of the other areas which I found just as a kind of fan of motorsport, and like I say, I thought I was just into sort of leading Formula One technology, but actually I know when our editor William Kimberley took me along to Silverstone Classic for the first time, I actually was envisaging something really, from many eras ago, that I didn't think that it would be that enjoyable. And to be honest with you, when I went down and met the engineers who were down in the pit lanes and they were working on the cars and they were talking to me about the engineering and the new technology that was being used, they suddenly, I recognised a few of the faces and realised some of the McLaren engineers who work on Formula One and all the others were actually there as well. They said, "Look, this is our passion. We love this. This is." So are you getting that from the sort of students as well and finding that?
Yeah, very, very, very much so. So when we initially launched the Formula One project, we weren't sure as to what the take up from the students would be, as in those that would be interested. And to be honest, there was a queue outside the office door. They were desperate to get the project, desperate to involve. And because of the diversity and range, and there's the various numerous roles for it. So for those that wanted to be practical and hands-on, could help and build the car. Those that wanted to do the analytical side could help with the scanning, the reverse engineering, looking at the side projects of that. We've got another follow-up to that going forward. So as we're going into this season, we're doing another race, we're doing another test. We're looking at some aerodynamic work. We're looking at how to improve the car. We've had some collaborative partners. So Evolution Measurement gave us a load of sensors so we could actually do a load of testing. And we've now got massive amount of data. We've got so much stuff to go through, which the students can actually do. And it's important, I think, that when a student's doing something in a university, they're doing something for a purpose. It's not just doing something for the sake of doing something, just to prove that the mathematics work and that's the application. So what you're actually got is you've got a series of analysis and data. They've understood the process. They've been involved in why we've done it. They've done the measurements. They can analyze it. They can then see the cause and effect. So you can see how the pressure differences are as you change the rake on the car or you change the wing angle or whatever it is you've done. So all of that, those simple changes that you can see, you can observe not only by the stopwatch and the driver feedback and comments, but also by the data that you're getting from the sensor. And that really is helping them become proper engineers going into industry with the practical application that they've needed. And it's also given them something whereby they're actually involved in historic motorsport and can see historic motorsport as a career path. It's a genuine career path for them to go into. I think
Which
historic
is exciting.
motorsport. Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you go back 20 or 30 years, it was probably a man in a shed. It's big business. The owners of these cars are high net worth individuals. They're very, very expensive cars to run, so therefore it has to be done properly. So yeah, it's a good opportunity for many students to go into.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And
Hey,
we
no
will
problem.
we will come back. We will come back to that. But I think next, sort of moving through career opportunities and that kind of thing. I'd firstly kind of wanted to go over to you, John. So, John, do you want to? And the reason I say this is obviously you've got a lot of experience in the industry, and your company obviously works with some of these drivers and engineering firms that obviously keep these cars going. And so you're right in the middle of that. And do you want to explain a little bit also about maybe the race series that are actually out there running, and some of the stuff that your company gets involved with, and maybe some of the people that could come and work with you in the future?
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Nicholson McLaren was founded in the mid-70s by John Nicholson and Bruce McLaren to look after the Cosworth DFE engines that McLaren were competing with at that time. Cosworth were producing the engines. They didn't have sufficient engineers to maintain them because it was such a successful product that they allowed some of the car manufacturers to set up their own engine shops, which is where Nicholson McLaren came from. Since then until now, we still continue to look after DFE engines and their variants. And obviously, they've moved from what was a current engine at the time to an historic engine. They're not the only engine we look after. We look after Group C, quite a lot of the Group C field, Jaguars, Nissan, Buick, and various others. And as they become historic products, they've been more and more difficult to maintain. They do suffer wear and tear. You can't buy parts off the shelf. So each rebuild is a project. There's a lot of parts out there that sort of appear from wherever. People have had them in storage, and they can be probably good parts from the time, but they've maybe been stored badly, so they've become corroded, or they were development parts that weren't quite right. Someone's kept them aside and think, oh, hang on a minute, I've got one of these. And it's not till you look at it, it's not very good. So part of our problem, or part of our work, is reverse engineering a lot of components. So, you can take a cylinder head, you need a new one, you've got to completely rebuild it. You've got to redesign it, you've got to scan it, CAD draw it, etc. I also think that one other thing that I would say about historic motorsport is it's very competitive. These guys that own these cars, the cars are worth absolute fortunes, but they really race them. They have a hard time on the circuit. They're not afraid of a few bumps and scrapes. And because of that, they do need repairing and maintaining. So there is a very good industry out there for historics. And it's not only about Group C and historic Formula One. The British touring car scene is really strong now with historics, and there's a great deal of interest in it.
No, I was going to say, Joe, because, and again, there is, like you said, the industry, as I started at the beginning, I guess, of the talk, I wasn't aware how big it was. And then, historic racing technology is a media part of like the Masters Historic Race Series. There was another thing that I kind of started to learn about. And obviously there are others, and you've got Le Mans Classic, for instance, which I was lucky enough to go to a few years ago, which just blew me away. It's kind of like, if you like music, which I do, it's the equivalent, I think, of like going to Glastonbury. You suddenly you've got a sensory overload, but it's really, really enjoyable, and there's nothing out of date feeling about it at all, and it's still very sort of magical. And I think we have to open up opportunities as well, from a marketing sense, I think, to get these young people into the sport to understand, because until you've experienced it, you really don't know what you're getting. And I think, if I may, Steve, that kind of brings me on to you, because one of the most important things I found when, we've been having articles in the magazines and all the rest of it, and online, people have sort of hinted towards the fact that, and I'm more than aware from other symposiums, that kind of thing, that we've got robo race, and we've got electrification, and we've got the whole talk of the internal combustion engine being no more in a few years' time. Obviously that affects thousands of vehicle owners around the globe, but young people are not gonna they want inclusivity, which is a big topic at the moment. They also want sustainability. So that led me. I know that you had over 30 years at Ricardo, and we used to come and interview you with a race tech hat on, and you kindly kind of gave me a beginner's guide at the many years ago, which I needed, to do with electric vehicles and the fact that they're not new. They've been around for some time, but also there is an alternative to keep the ICE going. So would you mind imparting some of your knowledge on that you've kindly given to me over the years?
Absolutely. So good afternoon, everybody, and thanks, Adrian, for that kind introduction. So as Adrian mentioned, I was at Ricardo for 30 odd years. I'm an IC engine guy. That's what I did for most of my career. But I also, was part of of that whole movement towards electrification and fuel cells and all that sort of stuff. So I have a reasonable view of most of the different propulsion systems and the pros and cons of each. But one thing that really stuck in my mind, and I'm trying to do more and more work on this now, is around the area of sustainable fuels. So we hear lots of talk about sort of moving for most of our road transport in terms of passenger cars to fully electrified vehicles, hybrids by 2030, and then full electrification by 2035. Which is all fine. We're heading in that direction, and it's laudable that we're holding this big goal out there. But the one thing that none of this actually deals with is all the cars that are on the road right now. And that's the big problem. There's 34 million cars on the road in the UK, 300 and something million cars on the road in Europe. And so that is why I believe there's a lot more work going into the use of renewable and sustainable fuels. And these have a fantastic opportunity to be applied in historic racing, actually in all forms of racing. Now, but what are these things then? So sustainable fuel is essentially a fuel that's been made using, for want of a better expression, new carbon as opposed to old carbon. So fossil carbon is old carbon that we dug out of the ground. It's put there millions of years ago, and we turn that into a fuel and we burn it. And that's new CO2 that we put into the atmosphere each time. If we were actually able to capture the CO2 that was already out in the atmosphere and rebuild that into a hydrocarbon fuel and then burn it again, actually the carbon just goes round and round in a big circle. And there are various different types of fuels that do that. Some of them are biofuels, different generations of those. There's synthetic fuels and e-fuels, but each of them, what they really do is recycle the carbon. So effectively, they are a carbon neutral fuel, and those are available, certainly in the form of biofuels. They're available right now, and are what are called drop-in fuels, which means they're a direct replacement for the fuel that you're using now. So the engine doesn't really know the difference. And it's a way of massively reducing your greenhouse gas emissions associated with your vehicle, your race series, whatever it might be. Could be 50% reduction, could be up to 80 or 90% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So a huge opportunity to get historic racing on the front foot. I think reducing carbon emissions and showing the world that there is an alternative to sit alongside electrification that deals with all of the cars that are out there now, irrespective of how old they are, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, because with all the money and all the will in the world, it's not realistic, I guess, to think that all the internal combustion engine cars are going to be swapped out for an electric vehicle overnight. I think the technology that's been worked on in the electric space is fantastic, but ultimately, motorsport has always led the way with the growth of technology that's come through to safety. Like seatbelts first being introduced in motorsport and all sorts of technology. So if historic racing can bring more and more interest from people with engineering backgrounds that can solve that problem, then I guess they are solving, problems of the future that are going to be, the climate change targets are there because we need to reduce these things in the next 5 years. So I think there's been a bit of a panic move towards something that obviously people thinking this is coal, this is fuels, this is fossil fuels, this is, the kind of petrol and diesel that they're thinking of, and the whole Dieselgate didn't really help its cause anyway. But yeah, so people have just been too scared from a marketing perspective. I think vehicle manufacturers quite rightly have turned their backs on the internal combustion engine to some degree. But I think many of them, if you really read between the lines, are actually looking at hybridization as well. So that doesn't really rule out the internal combustion engine. And as long as these fuels are green great for vehicles. But you did, I think, something that John mentioned before. You did allude to this being the fuels being ready to go, but will they affect the performance? I guess that's what the people
Not
racing will want to be asking.
depends. It depends. I
Yeah.
mentioned that there were these different grades. So the things that are available in reasonable quantities now tend to be the biofuels. Then we have synthetic fuels and e-fuels. And what really makes an e-fuel is the fact that we're using electrolysis to make hydrogen, which we then combine with CO2 to make a fuel. Those are really interesting, but there isn't a great deal of them around. So biofuels are available right now, come in the usual versions, or the historic versions were called first generation, and they did actually get into a lot of trouble and a lot of bad media because they came from, effectively there's an argument that you were displacing food in order to grow a crop that you turned into fuel instead. But with the advanced biofuels, the second generation, those are all coming from waste. So waste, straw, forestry residue, all of those sorts of things. So they have a much less impactful impact on land use. So yeah, that gets to that point. But that enables us then to use those fuels. And no, there isn't really a great deal of change in performance at all. There was a paper published at the IMechE's High Performance Powertrains Conference by Cosworth and by Corriton, who blend some of these fuels, that actually showed the difference in the combustion characteristics and fuel economy and things, and they couldn't actually measure a difference, really.
So as long as everybody's running on the same fuels, it's not going to lessen the entertainment value or the driver experience or any of that kind of stuff. No one's really going to know any different. And you're saying, as far as especially UK motorsport, that there's enough of these fuels available to be running motorsport, certainly. And I guess if there's more investment in that area, then I envisage we have these kind of classic car stations. I picture these. I kind of really admire the guys who seem to own all the franchises and have bought, I think, Asda or one of the, some crazy amount of money. But I see that somebody should just set up these pop-up historic and classic car stations, and they can have memorabilia and music and be themed or whatever they want. But you basically rock up there with your green classic car fuels fill up, and you could, and you can go on your meets up and down the country, and they just need to be stationed along the M4 corridors and up the M14 and all the rest of it, from Land's End to John Gate. And we'd all be able to just meet up and not feel quite so bad about things because we're putting these green fuels in. I don't know. I know that a lot of people's argument to motorsport is, look, don't worry, because the amount of mileage that people do is so little that it's not really impacting the planet. But I don't think that's good enough. I do think that historic racing has to be, and motorsport generally, but historic racing to not be confined to the history books, has to be on the front foot, creating history again and saying, look, we're going to be bringing in these sustainable fuels and this green technology, whether it's tire technology or fuel technology or safety technology, and actually that's how these old cars are going to keep going. I think the sort of stuff that it's happening at Mark Bolton University, and it just proves it. There is an appetite for young people to get involved in this, but I think if we position it correctly,
it's very relevant technology. It's right on the money at the moment. It's very relevant technology for future vehicles, let alone historic vehicles. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, look, thank you so much for that. As ever, you're very insightful. And again, I could talk for hours on this. But I will move next to a man I've known for a number of years, many years, and we met probably in the late 90s at Autosport, when the very foundation of an association then was appearing, the Motorsport Industry Association. And so, Brian, if I may, I'm going to hand over to you just to, if you could just give us an insight as to how and why that came about, and then how you are currently now, a few years later, feeling the historic racing market's going. Because I know you've had huge involvement in motorsport over the years. So I'll hand over to you now, Brian.
Thank you very much, Adrian. Hello, everybody. Yes, the Motorsport Industry Association was formed back in 1994, and 27 years old. And believe it or not, at that time, motor racing as an industry wasn't formally recognized by the government. which was one of the reasons that we decided to set up the MIA. But the other reason, or two reasons really, concerned young people. There was no real career development in those days. If a youngster wanted to go and work in Formula One, he'd phone a Formula One team and would be told, go and work at a race meeting with a club level racer at the weekend, clean the car and work your way up. Well, that had to change. And then when I was marketing and PR director for Lola Formula One, there was a change in the rules announced by the FIA, Max and Bernie at that time. And it had or would have had a very, very serious effect on the business that was being done by companies like Lola, Reynard and others. Went to see Max Mosley, and he said, well, if you don't like what we're proposing, get all the people together in your sector, in the motorsport industry, and come up with some ideas. Trying to get everybody together that they compete on a daily basis, and suddenly we're asking them to sit around a table and talk about the bigger picture was very, very difficult. But that's what we did. And we set up the MIA, and the guy who's running it now, Chris Aylard, has taken it obviously to an amazing level. And it has been responsible for really growing, developing, and telling people about the successes and potential that industry has as a world leading industry. Historic racing is fascinating. A couple of years ago, I went to the historic Formula One at Monaco. I was, believe it or not, a speaker on a cruise ship, and I took a group of enthusiasts. And to see grown men with tears in their eyes, and quite a lot of the women as well, when the JPS came, John Player Special came out of the tunnel, when the Flat 12 Ferrari engine started up, was extraordinary. And I've been fascinated by historic racing since then. Now, there's a big similarity between where we are now with historic racing and where we are with the MIA. The one thing that's happened, historic racing has become incredibly successful, but in a way, it's become very fragmented because it's grown off into so many sectors, from Formula One at one end right through to historic Formula Ford, even racing Citroen CVs for 24 hours. It is a tremendous program. And the problem is it's so fragmented, it doesn't have a voice. It doesn't have a forum. And so setting up the Historic Racing Association, one of our primary aims of the 4 primary objectives is to provide a forum and a voice to debate the future of our sport. With change come opportunities. And my goodness, we've seen a lot of change. Now, to exploit those opportunities is really, really important. And so that is one of the areas and the reasons we're setting up HRA, to provide that voice and forum to debate issues that are bigger than the day-to-day issues faced by the sports associations and clubs and owners and so forth. Secondly, to promote to young people. We love wallowing in the revival. We love dressing up and going to Goodwood. We love all those things that happen with it. The problem is that it's the future that matters. We have got to look and be seen as a sport that, yes, we race historic cars, but we are racing in and looking at tomorrow, the future, what new generations want. And we've got to go out there and appeal to them and market and promote historic motorsport. Most of them don't really know what it is. So that is a second pillar. The third pillar that we have is, as Adrian said, to present ourselves as embracing new technologies, embracing sustainability, not fighting against it. We want to learn and work with it and use historic motorsport as a platform for the technology that can look after the old cars in countries like Africa, third world countries, developing countries, where not everybody's going to have electric cars. So those are the sort of the main pillars for developing a historic racing association. And the interest in it has been tremendous. And so I think we've got a very, very exciting future to look ahead to, but we've got to work at it. It won't just happen on its own.
No, and Brian, as you quite rightly said, we've been talking about this for some time now, and I know that William Kimberley wrote about this a number of years ago. And one of the things when we've been at Autosport and some other sort of classic car and historic events, we have found. I thought we might get some resistance from the other clubs, but actually all the clubs have said, look, we need representation here. We need an umbrella organisation here. They're all working in their own silos. But actually, as a sector and as an industry, very much as you identified with the motorsport industry, some time ago, that actually this is a group that needs its own voice. It does need protecting. I know so far we've set up, we have got a LinkedIn group, which is the Historic Racing Association, funnily enough. So we would urge people to join that group. And to join the debate, because we're really what I think Brian and I and the team, we've all discussed it who are on this panel, but to be honest with you, Brian and I have probably spoken to about 100 people about this, and we haven't had one. Motorsport UK have said they give it their blessing and their backing. We've had race organisers, race event people, all the clubs, even as far as talking to the RAC, who said, yeah, look, we need more inclusion for young people, because if we don't get them on board, then we're all going to, it will be confined to the history books, and it would be ridiculous. We're kind of, we're not out of date in what we do. There is certainly enough technology, and I'm really grateful. I mean, like I say to Steve, that from your point of view, from your offering, for me, that's one of the key things, because if the sustainability piece is not managed, and then understandably society would say, look, historic cars are a thing of the past. I know you all had lots of fun with them for 100 years, but quite frankly, they're gone now. But I think, we've got to be careful as well, because you've got, horse racing's being looked at a little bit at the moment, but horses were, the main transportation. Then they came off. They didn't die away. Classical music, got electrified. Rock and roll came along, as you know, Brian, in the 60s, and people thought could be the end of classical music. It's not. It's very much loved by young people and people of all ages. And like I say, you can have a Glastonbury style event where they can all work hand in hand with each other. So, Brian, I really do appreciate what you've done so far. Sort of a lot of the effort in the Historic Racing Association side. I think from Historic Racing Technologies and Kimberley Media, we want to continue looking at those new technologies. And I'd say we're very grateful to Autosport to have this platform. And I do urge anyone who hasn't attended a historic event to give it a go, because it is so enjoyable. And I suppose to summarise on that, looking at the size of the sector that we looked at the beginning, I personally I've written a few things down along this, but this has been a theme. I think the Autosport team will sort of agree over. The affordability is really key, and I laughed earlier, but because Brian, you mentioned the 2CV racing. It's something William and I are desperately. You can race a 2CV for a 24-hour race for very little money. I do urge people to pull together with me and allow me to go off and do that for a bit of fun, because I'm desperate to go do it. But affordability, absolutely key. Sustainability, obviously inclusivity and diversity, which is happening in motorsport. And I think they'll all lead to a great future of mobility and historic racing. So before we run out of time, I know the clock's ticking down. It's going to swap us out shortly. So thank you ever so much to all the panel here. And like I say, we've got a LinkedIn group, and I hope you can join the Historic Racing Association as we move forward.
Thank you very much there, gents. It's fascinating, isn't it, to see really how historic motorsport is going to change as we move forward. And I hadn't really even thought about the fueling issue of it. I have to say, that might be a complete rookie mistake from my point of view. I was thinking of components and how you keep people working in that sport. But naturally, okay, we're looking at how we're going to fuel these forms of motorsport and keep it going. So it's absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much there, gents, and I think a brilliant way to finish our day. So I give you a massive round of applause if I could, but I dropped my tablet. But thank you very much there to the five there in that panel led by Adrian Goodsell just there. It is interesting, isn't it, to see how motorsport is going to develop over the next few years, and that's something we've been discussing a lot today on ASI Connect, and we're going to continue that discussion going into tomorrow. whether we use synthetic biofuels. Tomorrow, Paddy Lowe is going to be on one of the panels. He's talking about how he believes the internal combustion engine as we know it is going to continue into the future. And just because we're going carbon neutral doesn't mean we have to stop using these internal combustion engines. You see him there on the Future Power Chat. That's going to be led by Martin Lee, the head of podcasts at Motorsport Network. That first chat tomorrow morning